Welcome back to the NSP. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. On this episode, I'm joined by Sheldon Fernandez. Born and raised in Vaughan, Ontario, to Anglo-Indian parents, Sheldon had a mix of interests growing up, with computers and athletics being the dominant themes. With little nudge from his folks, he applied to the University of Waterloo and was accepted into the demanding computer engineering program. The university's famous co-op program was instrumental in starting him on his entrepreneurial journey. This started in New York City, but he was adamant he wanted to have an impact in Canada. He came home and has been a part of building companies ever since, including the artificial intelligence company Darwin AI. Additionally, he took a sabbatical and finished a master's in theology, volunteered in Nairobi, Kenya, and took creative writing at Oxford. We cover a wide range of topics from technology to philosophy. Before we get to our guest, a word from our partner for this episode, Big Brothers Big Sisters of Toronto. As a part of the NSP's continued effort to support veteran businesses and charities, listen to how you can be a big brother or big sister to a young person in need.
Hi, veterans. Right now, there are over 400 youth that need a leader like you who have the experience, skills, and determination to become a mentor. For over 100 years, Big Brothers Big Sisters of Toronto has been a solution to supporting local youth who have or are facing adversity by connecting them with a caring and consistent mentor. We're excited to have received funding to be a part of the Veteran Volunteer Initiative with the True Patriot Love Foundation, and we look forward to working together with Canada's veteran community. As a mentor, you'll be a provider of knowledge, guidance, and support to a young person. Right now, we're looking for 25 veterans to help youth reach their full potential. You can make a difference in your community today. Visit bbbstoronto.com/veteran mentors to join us.
And now, my friends, here's my conversation with Sheldon Fernandez. Sheldon, great to meet you in person.
You too, Chris. I know we've talked on Zoom for a few times, but this is the first time we're meeting in person.
Yeah, this is great. We're both down here at Waterloo, and thanks to Communitech for hosting us. I mean, Sheldon had some meetings beforehand, so they were kind enough to give him an office, and then we're actually in a recording studio of sorts, which is great. So hopefully the audio reflects that. I'm not sure if you've listened to any of the podcasts, and I'm going to put you on the spot with that, but I always just like to start with families, right? We talked about this a little bit beforehand.
Yeah.
When we sat down and had a bit of a chat and our get to know you. So let's start with family beginnings and maybe talk a little bit about where your parents came from. We start with your mom's side and mom's background.
Yeah, so my mom was born in Bangladesh. In a town in Bangladesh called Chittagong. So the capital of Bangladesh is Dhaka. And of course, Bangladesh, is a byproduct of the partition of India into East and West Pakistan. And then it eventually became Bangladesh. So my mom's family is from Chittagong in Bangladesh. And my dad's family is from Calcutta in India. But when people ask me, what are you? I mean, it's a question I used to get growing up because I didn't fit into a normal box. The short answer is that I'm Anglo-Indian, or at least my parents were. And what that basically communicates is that when Britain kind of colonized India, Britain and other Europeans, you had this intermixing of mostly white European men with the local indigenous Indian population. And the offspring of those unions, sometimes legitimate unions, sometimes not, was this hybrid people that were eventually known as the Anglo-Indians, because they were half European, and so they were typically lighter in skin tone and, spoke English. They were typically Christian. And so they were kind of sandwiched in between the hierarchy that existed in India when the British ruled India. They weren't British, so they weren't at the top of the social stratum, but they weren't Indian, so they weren't at the bottom. They were kind of in the middle. And as a result, they received a lot of preferential treatment from the British. They were involved in the construction of the railroad system and so forth. They played cricket, but they also played soccer.
Right.
And so eventually when India gains its independence in 1947 and the British leave, the social hierarchy flips. And the Indians, who have been subservient to the British for 400 years, are now running the country. And, the Anglo-Indians are kind of now on the outskirts of the social order. And so as a result, in large part, that people immigrated to England, Australia, and North America. And so my family eventually makes its way to Canada, and I exist as a Canadian-born Anglo-Indian. And so growing up, and we might be getting ahead of ourselves here, Chris, I was in this weird place where I didn't really understand my culture, so to speak. My dad would talk about India and cricket, but he also loved Westerns. He also loved Elvis. My mom could cook curry, Indian curry, but she could also cook lasagna. Most of the religious community we had were Catholics, and there were a few Indians, but not a lot of Indians, the way some friends of mine would have had a temple or mosque. So it was this interesting hybrid of growing up, and it'll be interesting to describe this to my son one day, or my sons, because I have two, because their mother is, at least ethnically or genetically, complete Indian. Like, her parents are both from India, whereas I'm Anglo-Indian, and they're Canadian. So it's going to be an interesting, journey to describe what they are to them.
You said earlier, is that people ask you, what are you? What was driving that? Was that based on how you looked? Was that based on sort of your cultural alignment? Was that based on this sort of what you just described about mom could cook curry, but lasagna? So one day you'd show up to school with leftover lasagna, and the next day it'd be leftover curry. What was the sort of impetus for those sort of comments?
I think the motivation was, growing up, when I grew up in the 80s in elementary school, the concept of being Canadian was a new idea. Right? You were something first, or your parents were something before you were Canadian. You were Italian, you were Portuguese, you were Indian, you were Japanese, you were Chinese. And so when kids would ask each other about their backgrounds, what are you meant really, what are your parents? Where are your parents from? And so I think that's what children were trying to ask, is what are you? And you'd always have to caveat it, because if you'd say India, they'd say, oh, well, you're Indian. But you were sort of Indian because your ancestors were not only from India, they were from Spain, they were from Scottish. My dad's mom, so my grandmother on my paternal side, was 100% Irish. And if you look at my son now, he looks 100% Irish. He got the Irish gene. So I think it's a way of asking, what are your parents? What culture do you have? What food do you cook at home? Who do you root for in the World Cup? That's the way kids would, I think, wrap their heads around the question back then, yeah.
And so your mom's from Bangladesh, your dad's from India. What were their family backgrounds? What did their families do in those countries, and how did they end up sort of coming from that part of Asia into Canada?
Yeah, so a variety of different jobs, but a lot of teachers in our family, a lot of tradespeople in the family as well. And, in India and Bangladesh back at that time, good professions were, there were the professional professions like being a doctor or lawyer and so forth. But it was complicated back then, even for the Anglo-Indians at the time. So, you had people that, were just cunning and did a little bit of entrepreneurship, but a lot of teachers and so forth. My parents actually met in Canada. So, like I mentioned, when India gained independence, you had this gradual migration of the Anglo-Indians from India into the UK, into Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and the United States. So my dad makes his way to Canada in 1969 through England, because we had some family there. So it was a common kind of setup where you'd go to England first, you'd kind of find your way there for a couple months, and then they made their way to Canada. My mom makes her way to Canada in 1972.
Via the same route?
Bangladesh. I think my dad went through Rome, actually. My mom went through the UK. And her sister, her eldest sister, established roots in Canada probably 5 years earlier, and then sponsored the rest of the family to come. So she arrived in Montreal back when Montreal was the place to be in Canada. And then, as I remember it, the families knew each other somehow, right? So I think part of the Bangladesh base went to Calcutta for some reason, so they sort of knew each other.
Okay.
And it's through that family connection that my parents meet and get married in 1974, move to Toronto, and then 3 years later have me. 3 years after that have my brother. 5 years after that have my sister.
When they went through the UK, they went through Italy, was that, did they see that as a stepping stone to Canada, or was that just the first step and then they thought, oh, okay, well, there's something else now has materialized, I'll go there? Like, did they have, was it just sort of going to where work was, or just going to leave where they were?
Yeah, those were really stopping points onto the ultimate destination.
Okay.
That was Canada.
Yeah.
Right? Canada was the destination. It was full of promise. I don't exactly know how people thought of Canada and other parts of the world in the 1970s, other than there's a lot of natural resources here. It's a country that's growing. It's welcoming to immigrants because of Trudeau. And so they kind of make their way there under that context.
Yeah, I've interviewed a lot of people, and well, a lot for me, I suppose. 30 or 40 interviews now, not all published, but there's very few people who are maybe one step removed from being first-generation Canadians that I've interviewed.
Right. Like
the vast majority's families have immigrated to Canada somewhere between the 30s and 40s and the 70s and 80s.
Right.
From all parts of the world.
Yeah.
Which I love. And I still think Canada is a great place to come to. It should be. I think we should have pride in the fact there's lots of ways to prosper and find your full potential here in a safe and secure place.
I absolutely believe that. I mean, I have everything I have today because of Canada. I don't think sometimes enough we appreciate that enough. It's always, what has the nation done for me, not what can I do for my nation. I mean, that's JFK's famous utterance in his State of the Union, I think, in 1960, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And yeah, I do think it is such a place of opportunity, and certainly that's why my parents came here and started afresh, right? Started in a new country. And I've done a little bit of digging around this concept of, my mom was a qualified teacher in Bangladesh, but her credentials weren't recognized in Canada. And when she came here, she had to work and start, earning, so to speak. So she was a legal secretary at Osler, the big law firm, for 40 years. It was a good job for her. She got to work with very top legal minds. I don't think that's what she envisioned she would do when she was in school as a little girl thinking, what do I want to be? But for so many parents, I think particularly from that part of the world, the sacrifice was, I am going to immigrate. I'm going to undergo the fear of starting in a new place with new customs and so forth. Probably face a little bit of discrimination, in a significant way. Certainly my parents have talked about that, not in a acute way, but have mentioned it to me. But I'm doing this for my children to give them the opportunities of Canada, of a welcoming society where you can prosper and so forth. And that is so much of not just my story, but my friends whose parents are also immigrants. And I think now the question that we grapple with is, we are beneficiaries of that sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
How do we pay it forward with our children?
Yeah.
Right? And I have a 5-year-old and a 10-month-old, so the journey's new for me. But that's something that I'm sure was going to occupy my thoughts for a little bit.
I often wonder if, I love the story about your mom, because I think it's an important message for people that it's about priorities and choices. So although she might have wanted to teach, or she had this vision of what she wanted to do, the priority at the time was to establish yourself in this new country, to start earning some money, to be able to set up the family, take care of your family. And that was the priority. I do get concerned that, and this isn't a young people thing by any stretch of the imagination. I think this is a lot of people tend to go, well, if I'm not absolutely loving at what I'm doing every minute of every day, then I need to find that. And that's a great ambition. But I wonder how realistic that is, and I wonder how that sort of frames your context of the world about things like service and sacrifice and priorities and choices.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think connected to that, Chris, is the idea that to truly do something of significance, whether it's family or in a professional context, you are, by definition, not going to love every moment of it. Right?
Yeah.
There's going to be struggle. There's going to be boredom. There's going to be, I'm a huge Roger Federer fan. And I remember reading an article where the author talked about the two GRs, the grace that he's often lauded for, but they go, what nobody sees is the grit, is the tens of thousands of hours on the practice court that you don't see. The dietary sacrifices to maintain top fitness. And I've learned this because I really study elite level sports in so many ways. You don't see that when you just see the finished product.
Right.
Right? And so, I worry about sometimes in our consumer society, which teaches you need to enjoy every experience and we need to cater to you and so forth, whether the generation underneath me is getting the wrong message a bit of, it's not all the romance, right? You need to see the grotty, grim side of it, even starting a business. I gave a talk to some high school students, I think it was last week, about entrepreneurship. And their version of entrepreneurship, as they understand it, is Elon Musk, is, Jeff Bezos, is the billionaires who have made it, right, without seeing the million entrepreneurs who have failed, that worked as hard and didn't quite catch the right time or breaks or what have you, right? So I think it's a lesson that we all learn in life eventually, but it's an important one to reinforce that there are going to be things you do not enjoy, and that sacrifice is how you become good, if not great, at something.
We need to be better at talking about the road to that podium moment.
Right.
It's so I interviewed Tim Fleiser the other day. So he's a former CFL player. I think he holds the record for number of Grey Cup wins with we've got 4 Grey Cup wins with different teams.
Oh wow! Okay.
And we talked about this, and he was very clear about how the real that moment's great, but the grind. He was really a sort of a high-end athlete from very early on. And all the things you sort of outlined there, right? Toughness is not just that sort of physical clashing that you see, but you mentioned diet, right? You mentioned, the time away from your family. There's all these things that sort of level of toughness and grit requires you to fight through if you really want to achieve something. And even then, there's no guarantees.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I don't know why I've always had this interest in studying the truly exceptional, the best chess players in the world, the best, tennis players in the world. And what you learn is that so much of what differentiates them from just the rung below is they're in love with the process of being disciplined. They're in love with the process of perfecting things. It's almost, in some ways, they're a super talent they have apart from their own genetic talent for their art that is really fascinating. So I don't know if you know this, Chris. The Chess Candidates Tournament is taking place in Toronto for the next 3 weeks. No. And what that is, it's the top 8 players in the world that are playing one another, and the winner of this tournament plays for the world championship against the world champion.
Oh,
and it's the first time it's ever been held in North America in the history of chess. So these are the very best of the best players. Like, these are the top 8 players in the world from millions of players, right? It'd be the equivalent of like LeBron James, Michael Jordan, of chess. And so I have a bit of a interest in chess. I always have since I was a child. I'm not very strong, but I know the innards of the game and the history of the game. And I met somebody there because I went with a friend who was Canada's youngest grandmaster about a decade ago.
Okay.
His name's Mark Bluestein. He took me with his wife and father. He got VIP tickets and all that. So I met somebody there who, at his peak, was in the top 8 in the world. His name is Ivan Cheparinov, and the average person would have no clue who this individual is, right? You would know Gary Kasparov, maybe, or Bobby Fischer, or somebody. But he was a coach, so he was he was an assistant, let's call it, to the former world champion Veselin Topalov, who was the champion from 2005 to 2006. So I asked Ivan, I'm like, what was the difference between you and him? You were like, at your peak, you were between number 8 and 20 in the world, but you were never quite in the top 5. So what was the difference? Was it that he was just a little bit better? Like, what was the difference? And his answer was fascinating. He said, Sheldon, in chess, you give your soul for 7 hours over the board, playing your opponent. And then the game's over, and you have a game the next day. Maybe against the same opponent, maybe against a different opponent if it's a tournament. And he said, most of us at the elite level find it really hard to let go of the game you just played and get sleep and diet and so forth and refresh so that you're ready to go the next day. It's exceptionally hard to do that. He goes, Topalov somehow trained his mind to just wipe it blank in a way that I've just never seen. So he had, a fraction more chess ability than me, but it was his psychological ability to not be affected by the previous day that was just unusual. And that's why he was a top 5 player and I wasn't. That was his take, and I just found that so fascinating.
It's great that he took the time to really kind of pull it apart and figure out that he could answer that question, because I mean that's a well thought out, well considered, which he's clearly thought about numerous times.
Yeah, it was such a fun day for me because I really get to speak to a professional in chess at that level of depth and reflection. Yeah. And it was just really fascinating,
Maybe we'll go back to sort of growing up in Toronto, in Vaughan. Talk a little bit about what your childhood looked like, what you were interested in, and probably, that sort of sense of identity piece too.
So I had a very idyllic childhood is the way I would describe it. So I grew up in Vaughan, about 30 minutes north of Toronto. There was my parents, my younger brother, my younger sister. And from an early age, I had an interest in sports, mainly at the encouragement of my dad. Sports was a way of keeping boys out of trouble, and having a 5-year-old now, I can totally understand that. He plays soccer 3 times a week, and I know why that's the case. But I had an interest in computers. This is when computers were novel. This is when it was unusual. You were the exception if you had a computer. Now you're the exception if you don't, and a weird exception at that, right? So my mom sent me to computer camp at the age of maybe 10, and the idea of I could give a computer instructions and it could do things was just fascinating to me. So I begged them to buy me a personal computer, and the promise my dad made was, if you bring home straight A's, I'll buy you one. And the knock on me when I was growing up from all my teachers was, Sheldon's smart, but he doesn't apply his full potential, and he should be getting all A's, but he gets mostly A's and B's and so forth. So the minute I had a motivator, next report card, straight A's, Dad, you have to get me a computer. And for my parents to buy a $3,000-$4,000 computer, given the household income, was a big sacrifice. And I have since let them know that. I don't think I appreciated how much of a sacrifice it was to get me a computer. But I grew up with computers when they were, again, novel, right? When there was MS-DOS and, no Windows and all this, and bulletin boards and so forth. So I had a deep interest in computers and machines, computer chess. I just really was into my own world around that. But I also played baseball at a fairly high level. I sometimes joke that's the one thing that probably kept me normal in high school and not ostracized because of my intelligence, was I hung out with all the jocks too, because I was a very good baseball player. And I just had this very comfortable life of self-discovery as a teenager in Vaughan, Ontario, right? My parents still live there. And so during the pandemic, I would go for these long walks, like an hour-and-a-half walk around certain areas of the neighborhood I knew, past my high school. And for me, those were formative years in determining who I was as a person, what was interesting to me, the discipline to get the grades I wanted to get into the University of Waterloo, it was all very comfortable. My parents were very conscientious parents. They were deeply religious. We were raised Catholic, and Catholic in the good sense of the word, in that they practiced their faith and they did, really tried to embody it and example it. And I still think back on those high school days with a lot of fondness, because I was preparing to go out into the world with this identity and set of interests that I just knew would turn into something. I didn't know what. And, my dad worked at TD Bank for his entire life, and he knew enough to tell me, if you're interested in computers, son, go to Waterloo. Like, it's the best school. And I didn't know much about Waterloo other than it was really hard to get into, and they had the co-op program.
Yeah.
And then in 1996, I made my way to the university, where that's a whole other chapter of my life. But, yeah, growing up, I know it's very complex memories for a lot of people because of circumstance. Mine was just very comfortable and idyllic.
You sound like, it's an interesting juxtaposition when you've, or maybe it's not, I don't know. Let me think about this for a second. So you talk about potential. You talk about how you did well in school, but your teachers thought you could do better.
Yeah.
So there's clearly something that was not particularly interesting for you about that. But then you're talking about how you were obviously thinking sort of deeply about your future as a young man and where you wanted to go and what was important to you. And maybe that was a sort of sense of identity, trying to define who you were and what you wanted to be. You thought about that much in terms of, are those things complementary, or are they sort of polar opposites in a way?
It's really fascinating because, so I don't know how it works now, but the way it worked back then, of course, is we had a fifth year of high school in Ontario called OAC.
Yeah,
right?
No, it's great. It's grade 12 now. Yeah, I did the same thing with OAC.
And the way it worked for university entrances is they would only look at your OAC marks. So I'd figured out in grade 11, probably even grade 10, I'm like, my marks now don't really matter, right? My OAC marks is what's going to matter. So I'm going to get good grades, like, 90s in math, 80s in English, but I'm not going to work to the bone where I'm getting high 90s because I don't have to.
Right.
And my wife is the opposite. My wife got the Governor General Award. She had a 98 average throughout high school. She got a scholarship to McGill. Like, she was the linear thing that just, was a bulldozer that went through everything. And she tells me that, she goes, I wouldn't have had the confidence, Sheldon, to know I could just turn it on in OAC and get the high 90s.
Right.
But I knew I could. And I don't know where that confidence came from, but I remember thinking, yeah, it's okay. Like, I remember even getting my grade 12 marks, and they were okay. Like, they were, again, 90s and a few 80s. And the teachers would always tell my mom, like, yeah, like, Mrs. Fernandez, normally when somebody comes to us when their child has a 91 average, we wouldn't complain. Sheldon should be getting high 90s. They would literally say that.
We have a problem with your son.
Yeah. And my mom would tell me this, and I'm like, Mom, don't worry. I got this. And she's like, Sheldon, you were 16, 17. What was I going to do? Like, you weren't a bad kid. You were into computers. You were doing your own thing. And I remember the day before OAC started, I couldn't sleep because I was like, okay, it begins now.
Right, game on.
Right, game on. And I did it. I got like the 95 average I needed to do to get into Waterloo. Where that sense of confidence, let's say, came from, I'm not sure. It was just belief that it was important to me to get into a really good school and that I was going to do something with the intelligence I'd been given. And my parents often, they're very religious people, and they would say, to those who are given a lot, great things are a lot is expected. And so, Sheldon, you have this intelligence. A lot is expected of you, is what was imprinted on me. And whether that was social responsibility or using your potential to its fullest, that was the message. And that's what motivated, the way I thought about high school. I had friends who did the opposite. I had friends who worked like crazy in grade 11, 12. Then they became 18 and they could drink and they could do whatever. They could drive and their grades plummeted. And I'm like, you guys, you're doing it backwards.
Yeah. You
should have just relaxed and enjoyed the first 4 years of high school and then turned it on. But not everybody thinks that way or can do that. I respect that. So I don't know if I don't know if I want to model this to my children, goof off for 4 years and then get it together. But it worked for me. And goof off is a loose term. I mean, I was never, a 60 student or not taking school seriously. I just didn't give it that extra 10% to get, the grades I would eventually need to get into Waterloo.
And what was the transition like to Waterloo? I mean, did you carry that confidence into university?
Okay, that's a great question, Chris. So here's the thing: when you're the top dog at your high school, you don't realize that in your program everybody is going to be the top dog at their high school. But there was an experience I had that negated that. So when I was in grade 11 or 12, I forget what grade it was. Maybe it was grade 11. I went to a program at U of T called Computing Insights, which was essentially a program they ran at the university for gifted high school students to go deeper into computer science. And when I went to that, most of the students there were what I just described, the top dogs at their high school that were now all together. And that's when I realized I was good at computer science. I was not incredible. I was not the LeBron James of computer science. There was a gentleman who was he was one of the boys in that camp with me. His name is Andrei Locek, and he was just like just another level of computer programming. He eventually went to Waterloo, and he was on the team that won the World Computer Programming Contest in 1999.
Okay.
Right? So, he was world class. And so going into Waterloo at the age of 18 or 19, I knew I was good, but I knew I would be around other Andres who were just exceptional. And my job was not to outcompete them. My job was to just do well and determine what I was going to do with this engineering education. For many of my classmates, it was a rude awakening. It was, they were used to being top of the class without having to study. Now they would have to get comfortable with the fact they'd be in the bottom half of the class even when they studied. And that was a big transition for a lot of people. It wasn't so much as it was for me because of this program I went to in high school.
What did you take at Waterloo?
I took computer engineering,
okay.
Which at the time was the toughest program to get into. Now I think it's software engineering or nanotech. And it's different than computer science insofar as you don't just learn how to program a computer, you learn how a computer works fundamentally from the hardware up. So it really gives you that gestalt understanding of electronics in a way that, if you're just taking computer science at Waterloo, you don't quite get in the same way.
Now, other than the formal education and the degree you walked away with, what did you really take away from your time at Waterloo, from your experience in university?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things was a sense of the world being much bigger than Canada and Vaughan. So the co-op program at Waterloo was very formative for me. At Waterloo, I don't know if your listeners know this, every 4 months at Waterloo you are switching between school and work. So you go to school for a semester, then you work for a semester, then you go to school for a semester. And a couple things happen as a result of that. One, by the time you graduate, you have about 2.5 years of working experience. You earn money during those co-op terms, and good money. So if you manage your finances correctly, essentially you're funding your own education. But my second co-op term, I was very lucky to secure a work term in New York City. And I'd never been to New York at that point in my life. New York was Seinfeld. New York was Home Alone, right? Home Alone 2. So imagine, Chris, I'm 20. Was I 20 or 21? I think I was 20. And in 1997, or was it 1998, beginning of 1998, I make my way to New York City, and here I am, this 20-year-old student from Waterloo that's working in New York City. And being on my own in that context without mom and dad, and really just being a young adult and taking in these different experiences was pretty special. And something happened on that co-op term. So I met an individual. His name is Gregory Brill. He was a senior consultant at this company. And Greg gave a presentation on some technical topic, but his delivery, his humor was just incredible. And I remember looking at him and thinking he has somehow fused, and I wouldn't have articulated it this way when I was 20. He has somehow fused the creative arts with his deep technical understanding in a way that is just remarkable. And he was a good writer and so forth. So Greg did theater and creative writing as his undergrad, and then did a master's in computer science, right?
Oh,
very unusual combination.
Yeah, you can't run across that too often.
Yeah, right? So he was just this unique fusion of an individual that taught me that, you know, the sum of your talents it can be greater than, you know, the whole can be greater than or the sum can be greater than the whole. And so that was really formative, and he eventually became a mentor to me, and we started a company with him as CEO when I graduated from school. So that the co-op experience and seeing and working in New York and working in California was very, very formative for me. And then also, and I didn't know it at the time, but the sense of entrepreneurship that resulted from those co-op terms. My best friend, Aleem Soumani, he was my roommate. He was an entrepreneur in an engineering program. I was an engineer in an engineering program that happened to be exposed to entrepreneurship, at least back then. Aleem always knew his calling was going to be to run a business or multiple businesses. So when we graduated from school, you know, Greg Brill wanted to hire us to work for him in New York, and we said, no, we're going to start something in Canada. And then he said, well, if I can't get you to work for me in New York, why don't we start a company in Canada that'll be a sister company for my company that's in New York? And, you know, 6 of us started it, and then after 9/11, we merged them, and it became one firm, and we grew that firm from the original 6 to 700. So I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but if I were to pause, the things that Waterloo really instilled in me was a sense of the world at large, right? That I lived in a microcosm of the world, and that, you know, there was an entire world out there that I had yet to experience. A sense of entrepreneurship, and the sense that although I was very technical at heart, I had these other attributes that were yet to be discovered, right? I had this artistic side in me, I had this writerly side of me, and that I had to probe and understand those, after I graduated from Waterloo.
Yeah, it's great you mentioned that, because I just wrote down about creativity and wanting to maybe pick at that a little bit. Because I imagine as a programmer, there's all sorts of ways to be creative, but I'm wondering if your experience, if that's a different type of creativity or exercises different kind of creative muscles than this one that you're talking about with, is it Greg?
Greg, yeah.
With Greg, like how his creativity manifested itself in a different way.
Yeah, so like when you have technical creativity, it's like somebody described it as creativity in a straitjacket. Because you can be creative, but it's in a very narrow realm with rules, right? When you're programming a computer, there's rules. There's mathematical rules, there's the rules of language, and you can get creative with that design and architecture and so forth, but it's not a blank canvas, right? If you tell a programmer, program this for me, there's a variety of ways they can do it, but the answer and the way you test your answer is the same. If I say, Chris, write me 3 paragraphs on what it means to be a computer programmer, most people will struggle with that because there's no end game. It's what you make it. Mm-hmm. So that creativity, or what I call unbounded creativity, is a very different beast than technical creativity. There's elements that map to one another, but I remember when we started Infusion, which was the company name, one of my first jobs was to write books on technology, and I approached it first as if I was programming. I do it late at night when, you typically do programming with music and so forth. And then I realized that's a very different type of creativity. It is not little bursts of creativity when you write. It is a sustained kind of energy you need over a couple hours. And that actually the best energy, for me at least, doing that was in the morning. So, there's various kinds of creativity, but those were the 2 that, I had to tease out when I was in my, early 20s.
Why did you not want to set up a company in the States? Or why did you not take Greg's offer and you wanted to come back and do something in Canada?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. around the time that we were students, there was a lot of media attention on the brain drain, is what they called it.
Right.
Right? In that the best engineering students were leaving Canada to go work in the States because of better salaries and more opportunity and so forth. By the time we were at that stage, we had lived in New York for 8 months. I'd also lived in Silicon Valley for 8 months. And I think by then I knew that I loved working in the States, but I didn't love living there. I preferred, and Aleem and others preferred, the civility and moderation of Canada. And so the question for us was, how could we combine the entrepreneurial spirit of our American friends but live in Canada? And we did that by creating a company that was based in Canada but had all these international offices. And a lot of students make the opposite decision. They go and live and flourish in the United States. Many come back after they start families because they want to raise their children in Canada, and they bring all that entrepreneurial ambition back to Canada and try to start something. We did that. I did that. But I knew that I preferred just the civility and tolerance of Canada in a way that it's just subtly different from what it is in the United States. And of course, that's a whole other conversation. But I was Canadian first, and I wanted to live here, meet my partner here, raise a family here.
Do you get a sense in hindsight that made any difference in how maybe easy or difficult it was to get the business up and running, to scale? Any of those things? Would it have been easier to do it in the U.S.?
Most certainly.
Okay.
The access to capital you have in the United States, particularly Silicon Valley, their sense of scale, the mentorship you get at that scale, we're trying to create it here, and there are opportunities here, but the level in which they think of disruption and transformation, particularly in Silicon Valley, is just an order of magnitude beyond what we think here, right? A Canadian entrepreneur here would be happy with a $100 million exit or a $100 million business or a $100 million market. In the States, it's how am I changing the world? How am I getting? I might not do it, but my ambition is to do it. How do I become the next SpaceX and solve climate change? Or really solve the energy problem. So I'm a $10 billion company. Like, that's the ambition and scale that they think around and that they make investment bets on and so forth. So I think no doubt it is easier to scale a company in the United States because their economy is 10 times bigger than ours. It's probably easier to get capital. But there's a lifestyle trade-off that is not appetizing to a lot of entrepreneurs, including myself. And so how do you do that here in a way that is competitive?
Now, when you came back home and started your first business, what was that focused on?
So in Fusion, we basically wrote custom software initially for very large financial institutions. So we often joke Lehman Brothers was our first client.
Oh, really?
And we outlived our first client because, of course, they folded in 2008. And so we grew up on Wall Street, right, writing trading systems for very large banks. We did the same thing. We were able to parlay that success and do it in Canada for the banks here. And then we branched out and we did work with oil and gas companies, pharmaceutical companies. At one point, we had an office in India. We tried the Indian offshoring thing. Didn't quite work with our business model. But we opened an office in London, in Dubai, in Poland, where we got access to a lot of talent. I had an interesting foray at Infusion, where for about 2 years I worked in Hollywood. So some, maybe not all your listeners might be familiar, of course, with Paula Abdul. Paula was an 80s pop star.
Straight up.
Now tell me. I'm impressed, Chris. Good quip. And she, of course, was a judge on American Idol, which is how many listeners now would know her. But at one point, she left American Idol, and we created a company called Audition Booth that Paula Abdul was the spokesperson for, which was casting for Hollywood digitally. Now,
Okay.
right? The idea is, back in the 2000s when Survivor was a thing, it still is a thing, but when it was first coming out, if you wanted to audition for these shows, you'd send in a VHS tape. You'd FedEx in a VHS tape. It would come to these casting people, and they would literally be in a room about as big as this with two VCR machines and TVs, and they would look at all these VHS tapes. So we had the idea back then, well, why don't we digitize it, right? This sounds quaint now because we're in 2024, but people have webcams. People have, the ability to record themselves. So we created an entire platform for Hollywood called Audition Booth, where you could audition for things online. And we actually did the casting, if I remember, for like Glee, for American Idol.
Oh, really? Yeah.
For a couple of shows. And then, of course, Facebook and YouTube just came in and became the standard, and that's what happens. But it was a fun 2-year foray into Hollywood for me. So we did that. And then, again, we were acquired in 2017 by a company called Avanade. They're owned by Microsoft and Accenture.
Okay.
And at that time, we were about 600 people. So it was a 17-year journey to build this business and then sell it.
So what was the motivation? You're doing all of this. What was the motivation then to sort of take a bit of a step to the side and do a master's in theology?
Yeah, so I was not enthralled with running a business the way my partners were. Right? For me, it was the technology was fascinating. I enjoyed elements of it. But like I mentioned, Chris, when I was in my mid-20s, I had this creative part in me that yearned for expression beyond just the narrow confines of my job. And so in my last year of undergrad, I took a theology course called Jesus, Life, and Legacy, which was looking at the historical person of Jesus and what the tools of history could tell us about him, apart from the Bible, apart from faith. Like, what do we know about this man from a historical point of view? And that just really ignited in me a curiosity and, frankly, an anxiety around faith. And so I said, I have time because I was single and I was traveling a lot. And so I started a part-time degree in theology really to get answers to questions, is what I would say initially, to the questions I had around faith. And then again, to use the creative side of my brain around theological writing and reading and so forth that I just didn't have exposure to in my undergrad. And I often joke, it wasn't until studying theology for about 4 years that I realized I was actually a philosopher. Studying theology turned me into philosopher is what I say. So it was a very, rewarding time, I would say, because I would do my job and it was meaningful to me, but in a narrow way. And then there was this whole world of theological exploration and so forth I'd do at night. I'd read like the fundamental texts. I'd try to put these things together in my head. I'd write about it. And I often say the rigor of engineering from a mathematical point of view actually was beneficial because in certain types of systematic theology, you take these arguments and you build them on one another and so forth to create a system. And so being an engineer was actually really fascinating in that context.
What one thing or maybe things surprised you the most about or did you learn in this theological education that you sort of went, oh, I didn't think of it that way, or that reframed your thinking, or maybe it was even just the reconciliation of an engineer mind into now said theologian to philosopher?
I can tell you an aha moment I had. I was in the third year of studying theology, and there's this part in the Bible where Jesus apparently misspeaks. Like he says something that he's talking about a time period, and he references a time period where so-and-so was the high priest. And if you go to the Old Testament and you look at that time period, somebody else is the high priest. Like his son or his father is the high priest. So for years, theologians have tried to reconcile this apparent mistake that Jesus made because he's supposed to be infallible.
Right.
And there's all these intricate, verbal gymnastics and stuff that people do to try to reconcile these two contradictory things. And I remember my teacher, who's a bit of a bohemian, basically said, guys, can we just agree that Jesus may have misspoken?
That's what I was thinking. Yeah,
he just got it wrong. Like we all misspeak that he just misspoke, and that doesn't really take away. And for the people around me, this was a question of burning importance because this text they believe was the inerrant word of God, and I'd veered away from it by then enough to a point where I'm like, look, this is an interesting intellectual exercise, but the answer to this question no longer matters to me in the way it matters to everybody here, or to a lot of people here. And that was my thing of like, I'm not invested in these deep questions anymore because I kind of believe that a lot of this is constructed by the men of their times, and there's great meaning in it, but there's not transcendental meaning in it for me the way it is for you, right? And that was kind of my conversion, let's say, from theology to philosopher.
So when you that 17-year journey with that company,
yeah,
did you sell that company?
We sold it, yeah.
Okay, so you sold that company. You're doing a master's in theology. So what's next? Did you have something in mind specifically, or did you go on a bit of a journey to figure out what made sense for you?
Yeah, so one part that's missing from this is about halfway through that 17-year journey. So in 2007, I'm really kind of going through a midlife crisis at 30, right? My mom jokes. She's like, how self-involved that you can do a midlife crisis at 30. But I went to my partners, and I was just deeply unsatisfied with my life at that point. Like not in a crisis kind of way, but I was just really not in a good place of fulfillment. I'd broken up with my girlfriend. I was traveling a lot. I didn't really know what my life was about anymore. The work didn't speak to me. So I said to my partners, guys, like either one of two things. Either I'm going to leave because this just isn't working for me, or I'm going to take time off. And the main partner in the business, a wonderful woman named Deborah Johnson, who was married to Greg Brill, they started the business essentially, was very kind and said, Sheldon, I originally told her I wanted 4 months off. She's like, I think you need a year. She's like, go take a year off, and when you come back to us, we'll let you keep your equity. It was very generous. And when you come back, look, if you decide that you're leaving, we will figure something out, or come back refreshed and we'll continue building the business. So it's very, very magnanimous of a partner to do that. And so I did 3 things during that time off, Chris. I completed my master's. So I wrote my thesis on neuroscience and metaethics, which we can get into, which is very relevant to the AI company I would eventually start. I did volunteer work in the slums of Kenya, in a slum called Kangemi, just outside Nairobi. So I lived, in very modest accommodations and really, experienced what it was to be at ground zero of a country like that. And then I did creative writing at Oxford. I did a 6-week program, which is still to this day very special. And I was thinking of doing PhD work in theology or philosophy. And we can talk about, I eventually realized that wasn't for me. And I came back to Infusion really recharged and ready to go. And that's what led to that, another, whatever it was, 8 years of building before we sold it, right? So when we sell it, I was agitating for us to sell because I was ready to move on. I knew that I would do something else. I didn't know what it was. I had some ideas in my head. And then a couple things happened. So I told you I was really into chess and computer chess. So chess was conquered by artificial intelligence in the early 2000s. By that time, the best chess computers were far and away better than the best human beings. The next game on everybody's list was Go. Right? Which was 10 times more complex than chess. And the prediction was that AI would eventually be good enough to beat the best players in 2035 or maybe even 2050. DeepMind, company bought by Google, creates a machine called AlphaGo that beats the human world champion in 2016. So 20 years at least before anybody thought it would happen. And that's when I say, okay, how did they do this? And I really went into the machinery of machine learning and deep learning. I started writing about it, speaking about it. And in 2017, that got the attention of a former colleague of mine who worked at Infusion. His name's Arif Virani. He reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, hey, I see you talking about all this deep learning, machine learning. Two things, Sheldon. A, I want to understand it myself. And B, let me introduce you to a friend of mine who, by the way, is a professor at the University of Waterloo and does all this research. So in 2017, I meet Alex, or Professor Alexander Wong, who's Canada's Research Chair in AI. They've created all this IP. We have numerous conversations, and it turns out a couple months later, I'm running a company called Darwin AI. So that's part 3 of the journey. But I wanted to stop there because I don't know if we want to reflect back on any of the previous part of the story.
Yeah, I think there's I want to talk maybe a little bit about the year off you took, or maybe just more broadly about leaders, whether public or private sector, and how you find that sort of balance of health. Because we were talking about earlier, you get a little more time in your hands these days, and one of the things you're doing is prioritizing some health, right? Have you done that over the years? I mean, other than that break, and I think really, like you said, I mean, just a hats off to leadership at Infusion for having this sort of having the vision and the leadership to really provide you that space, right? Because I think that there's a lot of companies that maybe wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So what's your journey been like in trying to balance this professional ambition and curiosity with these other things to keep you healthy and being able to perform at high levels?
It's such a great question. I've always enjoyed cardio. It's my equivalent of release from being tense and being anxious and so forth. Nothing will reset me like really working up the heart rate and sweating. So that's always just been a part of me. I used to run a lot, Chris. And then, like many irresponsible runners, I had joints, Achilles tendonitis, and so forth. So now it's the Peloton on the bike.
Right.
If I could give the 20-year-old version of myself one piece of advice, it would be to do yoga and stretch.
Right.
So I've always prioritized fitness and working out as a coping mechanism for the pressures of professional life. Even with children, I would make time for that. My wife and I both do that. When my son was born, Max, the first one, I would put him on the Bjorn and I'd go for these long walks, right? And it was easy to do when we had one kid.
Right.
I don't do it as much when we have two because there's both of them to contend with. But recently, Max was at his grandparents'. So Milo, my second son, I put him in the Bjorn and I went for one of those walks. And it's like having 20 pounds of weight on you. I came home and I told my wife, I'm like, okay, now I understand why I was so fit when we had Max, because gosh, is this hard. Like 45 minutes of walking at pace with a baby on you, you will get a good workout. And I used to do this daily with Max, and for an hour at least. So I've just always integrated some form of fitness into my routine to maintain, my sanity when it comes to the professional pressures of whatever I'm doing. I probably didn't pay as much attention until maybe 3 years into Darwin, with respect to mental health, and we can talk about that. I also found that it was the big space I have now is actually the diet side of the fitness equation, right? And eating properly. The first thing that goes for me when I'm under intense stress is eating, because indulging in food is the one thing I can do that just gives me a visceral level of comfort in that moment, not after. That'll just release and be like, okay, I feel better. And then, of course, it's the aftermath of, oh, I shouldn't have eaten those 6 donuts.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I like to explain it to people. I said, if you ever let a Labrador Retriever into the food bag, that would be me. They'll just eat until they hit paper at the bottom and then go, oh, now I don't feel so good. So
when we were in the really tense times at Darwin, be it the pandemic or being the end of the journey, I would just like Manhattans every evening with chocolate, knowing that, hey, I'm going to have to repair this at some point. So fitness was a way for me at least to offset the poor eating as a result of the pressures. Yeah.
I'll share a podcast with you after this. I'm actually going to put it in my weekly newsletter, but Lex Friedman just had a great. I think it was him. No, actually, it wasn't him. It was a guy in the UK. Had a great conversation with a US guy on everything about fitness, nutrition, and everything else.
Yeah.
And I've listened to a lot of these over the years. Well, some of them I don't find particularly compelling, and a lot of them get really deep into the science, which is fine. But one of the things, if you want to make it accessible to people, you have to be able to be an expert who can explain it in a way that
Yes.
almost everybody can understand. This guy does an incredible job of that. So I'll
Please send it.
I'll flip it to you later.
Yeah.
But it's you really cannot outwork a bad diet. There's no way.
Especially as you get older, right? Like you can do it at 20, at 23 when you're metabolic. You can eat Tupperware as long as you're working out.
Yeah.
But you get to our age, or I'll use like you get to a certain age, and it's like it is more important than working out. You can indulge, of course you can indulge, but your day-to-day diet needs to be responsible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree. And then you're performing better.
Yeah.
You're sleeping better.
Yeah.
Like there's so many benefits.
Oh yeah. I think that's one of the things post-Darwin that you feel better, right? You're eating responsibly. You can indulge a little, but you're not the Labrador in the food
No, that's
thing,
me.
right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and especially if the combination. I heard Guy Ritchie interviewed once, the UK film director.
Okay. Yeah.
And he says it's actually not the food. It's the beer or the two beers beforehand that lower my inhibitions and my decision making that then get me into that bag of chips or whatever else. He says that's what ends up killing me. It's the beer that's the catalyst for the bad eating.
So, Chris, I've sometimes thought if I could have one superpower in life, like not an existential superpower, but like a rather trivial superpower, it would be to eat whatever I want, when I want, without any adverse health effects. Like, and to feel as if I had a good diet. Because then, I tell you, I would have 2 Big Macs every day. I would have, like, Dairy Queen Blizzards. I would just go to town. Because, like, fast food for me is, like, where it's at. And I don't do it regularly. Of course, I have discipline around it. But, man, do I love it. Like, just sinking your teeth into, like, a Whopper with cheese when you're starving. There's not a better feeling.
I'm not sure too many people on the planet would think that's a trivial superpower. If you could fly or have that,
right?
I bet that would be an interesting poll.
You'd have to think about it.
Yeah, that'd be a great survey.
Like, just imagine eating, and maybe because you would have it every day, the visceral appeal would wear off, maybe. But I don't know. There's that documentary Super Size Me, right? Where the guy eats McDonald's for, I think, a month, and his health just goes to hell, right? And it's like an interesting take on it.
It's one of the biggest challenges with food is that unlike other things, drugs, alcohol, whatever other bad habit, you remove that from your life. There's no adverse effects. You have to eat.
Yeah.
So it's managing this thing that you're having trouble managing, knowing you still have to do it every day.
You got to,
It's interesting. So maybe on the mental health side, we just sort of parked that for a second. We talked a lot about the physical and nutrition, but what sort of challenges do you face as a founder, as a CEO, as an entrepreneur in this sort of high pressure environment? And trying to manage mental health concurrently. Yeah.
So as a leader, and so for context, I was a CEO at Darwin. On the outside, you prioritize the well-being and mental health of your company, of your direct reports, and everybody. You're giving them the support you need. You're being a rock for them when things are bad. You're being the cheerleader to get everybody motivated. And when people do that, it's very demanding, and they often don't think about their mental health. Like, what effect is this taking on me? And about 2 years into Darwin, at the recommendation of another founder, I got an executive coach who's really a therapist. My wife's a psychiatrist, and I certainly, through her, have seen the benefits of therapy and the importance of mental health, no doubt. But just like a race car engine, you need to ensure that all parts are working so that you're performing at a very high level. And the engine of that is your mental health. It's as important, if not more important, than your physical health, or they're both equal, let's say. So my executive coach really helped me get through the pandemic, the losing of big fundraising rounds. Like, he was, the person I had where I could just be completely vulnerable, completely raw with, completely honest with, to shepherd me through those difficult times. Then I could then be the high performer I needed to be to the rest of the company, right? And it doesn't always have to take the form of a coach, but there are many ways, just like you have to eat the right food, there are many different exercises and routines and so forth you can do to make sure that you're taking care of your mental health. One of which is restoration, right, of downtime. Like, people think of downtime as an indulgence. No, it's actually important to give your brain a break so that you can come replenished back to your job and so forth. And as a leader, what I've learned, Chris, it's important not just to do that, but to model that for the rest of your employees. To model that, it's okay to take a couple days off because it's becoming very, very challenging and you just need some time. There's limits to that, of course. Mm-hmm. But, I'd always take the day off for my son's birthday because it was important. And it was a way of signaling to the rest of my team, hey, your children are important. Get the balance right. Take it off. I'd even tell them, go take the day off. Like, I'd almost force them sometimes. Mm-hmm. So attention to that and honesty about that, I think, is so important. And I think we're making a lot of progress as a society around this. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, it was, just on the cusp of the consciousness of everyday society. Now we have a day where we talk about and celebrate the importance of mental health and so forth. We still need to do a lot of work in the corporate realm around this, but I certainly have gone on a journey of realizing how important it is, especially, being someone that had to run a company during some very difficult times.
One of the things that surprised me since I left the military was how poor we are at sharing our experiences in transition out of the military. Some of our concerns, our vulnerabilities, our anxieties with one another. And I'm wondering if there's a similar thing in the sort of the tech leadership founder, CEO world about, because it's a competitive space as opposed to the military has elements of competition, but it's obviously not for profit. So, it's not a profit, it's a public system. So, is that something that is a barrier you see to founders, CEOs sharing with one another, what they're experiencing to make each other better? Or is that a more healthy sort of environment of sharing?
Yeah, I think it's actually become fairly healthy. So when I ran Darwin, there were numerous CEO forums where you could just be vulnerable and honest with one another about your challenges, about the fact that we're all kind of faking it, about the fact that... we have all these wonderful social media posts, but let me tell you what's really happening, right? How do you deal with somebody resigning on day one, things like that. So I think, especially with venture-backed companies, they're very good at creating these spaces where you can have honest conversation. So I think we're getting better at that. You used a word that really resonates with me, and that's vulnerability. I often get asked for book recommendations from aspiring entrepreneurs, and the book I recommend often surprises them. It's a book called Daring Greatly, written by Brené Brown, who's one of the world's experts on vulnerability. She's researched this idea of vulnerability, and her assertion, which I agree with 100%, is we truly have an authentic relationship when we can be vulnerable with one another. Right? I mean, you think about a good friend when you go to lunch with a good friend, and you'll ask each other how you're doing. Then one of you will say, hey, how are you really doing? Yeah, okay, you went to the game last night or whatever. Hey, how's your marriage? How's being a dad? How's blah, 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 blah. And you share with, true honesty. So her assertion is vulnerability is the metric by which we judge the authenticity of relationship. And so I often am a leader with empathy. I lead by empathy, right? If I don't know something, because I don't know the answer, let's figure it out together, right? And I think that understanding and, willingness to embrace vulnerability is so key for human relationships in any context, but one that I think we can do a lot of interesting things with in a professional context, right? I mean, I'm thinking about the military, Chris. Like, of course, you're not going to have this conversation in a heated zone where you need to be sharp and you have somebody else's life in your hands. Of course, you don't have the time for that. Just like at a board meeting, I don't have a time to talk about your insecurities because I have a board that needs answers and so. But in the transitory part of that, what can we share with one another that can be beneficial to our journey and, us as professionals and how we handle things, how we respond to things, how we understand each other's sufferings and growth and so forth. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to connect here. I mean, you could just start with anywhere on this circle where there's a retired U.S. 4-star general named Paul Funk, and I think he started when he was a young officer with these sort of tenets that he started to pick up as he was going through his career.
Yeah.
And when he retired, I'd have to look again online. I don't know. There's 30 or 40 of these funkisms, as they were called, and the first one is secure yourself first. And if we link a lot of these things we were just sort of discussing. I mean, you secure yourself first, physically, mentally, nutritionally, whatever that looks like. Well, then you now have the ability to be there as a leader, because doing what you just described as a leader, I mean, it's emotionally taxing. I mean, you are investing in others.
Yeah.
You are, you're sharing part of yourself, whether it's evident or not, but you are taking on some of that emotional burden, that emotional load from dealing with other people's problems, their insecurities, their emotions. And then you get around to the actually still having to perform and run a business, and that can be done because then you've gone back to taking care of yourself and your team and your business, and it's just a circle. But if you start missing out on some of those pieces, that's when problems start to come in, and it's definitely not easy.
Yeah.
It gets back to discipline and having to be constantly looking at what you're doing, adjusting, accepting that you're going to fail at some of these things, and wanting to just continue to just be a little bit better every day if you can.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is it's great to have these ruminations in the comfort of a podcast, right? How do you make them work in the whirlwind of either a business or the military context or what have you? That's where the discipline of these ideas is so important, right? Where it's almost like second nature. Hey, guys, we're going to do a postmortem on this because that's our best practice, right? Things are on fire. Let's deal with the fire. Okay, post-fire, let's not just celebrate. Why did this happen? Okay, how does it not happen again, right? That just needs to be an embedded part of your culture, and that's where leadership is so important, right? What was the quote I heard from somebody? Like, management is doing things right, leadership is doing the right things, right? So you set the priorities for your business. You need to prioritize a postmortem that is going to let everybody be vulnerable and, learn from this experience. If you don't make time for that and you don't insist on that, you'll move on to the next thing that's the next profit thing or whatever without learning as an organization. And it takes so much discipline because, at least for us running a business, it is a whirlwind it's always a whirlwind, but it's in a special whirlwind for 3 years where you're just trying to get things going. You don't know, nothing's working. You're just chasing like a blind dog, all these different things. There's no order. How do you bring some of these best practices to that? It takes leadership and discipline.
Are you getting any sort of indicators that there's the group of people who want to lead, who want to sort of take on this responsibility that you just outlined is shrinking?
I haven't gotten signaling of that. But I do wonder, with the culture that we've created of me first, what's in it for me, and I don't know if my parents thought this way about my generation, the way maybe every cynical generation does. Back in my day, it was like this. But there is something to to the idea with social media of you are constantly the consumer, right? Everything you're served up is to pique your interest, is to appeal to you, is to meet your every want and need, and leadership is putting aside those needs for the greater good and so forth. So I hope not, Chris. And that's why actually I'm a fan of sports. Like my son, as I mentioned, is in soccer 3 times a week, and this is of his own volition. He loves it. We've tried skating, and soccer is his thing. But we were at the practice yesterday, and this is house league. These are 5 and 6 year olds. Right. My wife was with me. She didn't grow up with sports the way I did, but at some point they're all doing their own thing. The coach stops and says, "Okay, we're stopping until you all start paying attention." That means if one of you is not paying attention, everybody suffers. And you could see them all perk up. And my wife kind of looked at me. She's like, "Hey, that's pretty intense." But I'm like, no, this is how they learn. Mm-hmm. Especially boys.
Right.
And you could see the beginnings of the effects of these sports on, hey, I may want to screw around because I'm 5, but if I don't stop, everybody else here suffers. It was such a simple thing, but it's like I could see my son, who likes to be aimless sometimes, like the other boys looking at him, and he kind of perked up. So I hope we don't lose this sense of leaders that step into things and so forth. And I think we have enough of a social fabric where that won't be the case. But I do worry about the effects of hyper consumerism on children through social media and what that teaches you about that your needs are the most important thing in the world all the time, right? I was reading this book about the emergence of online dating and so forth, and somebody had a quote of, the problem is that society now tells people to approach dating the way they approach shopping, but in shopping nobody points out the shopper's flaws, right?
Yeah.
So I hope not, and I think the optimist in me knows that in a large-scale population, you'll always have the exceptional people that are really going to rise and take this responsibility. But I do wonder about the mass effects of some of these, very powerful platforms and so forth, and what effects they're having on young minds.
Maybe this is a good spot to pivot to a couple of questions about AI. I think a good place to start is maybe to get your sort of definition of AI 101 for the listener, just to sort of set the context about maybe what it is, what it isn't, and then we can sort of go from there.
Yeah. So first of all, the definition will change depending on whom you talk to and what context you're using it in. The original definition, when the group of computer scientists got together in 1950 for one of the very first AI conferences at Princeton, if I remember correctly, it was something along the lines of artificial intelligence is behavior from a non-sentient entity, so like a computer, that behaves in ways that we would classify as intelligent. And you can see it's a purposely vague definition because the definition of what constitutes intelligence has changed throughout the years. So they used to say at one time, behaving intelligent would be, can it play a game of chess? Because chess is an intellectual game.
Right.
And when it started to play chess, it said, well, can it play chess well? Okay, it can beat 80% of human beings. Okay, well, it doesn't even know it's playing chess, so it has to play at the world championship level. It does that. Well, it still doesn't know it's playing chess, so it doesn't count.
Right.
So we say artificial intelligence is, can it exhibit any behavior we would classify as intelligent without you knowing that it's a human being, right? That's a term. Without you knowing that it's artificial.
Right.
And so we are approaching the point where with things like ChatGPT, it's hard sometimes to distinguish between, are you conversing with a human being or are you conversing with a artificial intelligent entity? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the definition, the working definition that we use in our industry.
Okay.
And of course, the explosion of AI in the last 6 or 7 years has just been remarkable, right? When I started Darwin AI with my colleagues, what AI was really good at doing was looking at pictures of images and then telling you what that was. That seems quaint now. But back in 2016, Chris, like if you showed, how do you teach a computer that is looking at a lion, right? Let's take that example. My 5-year-old can do that almost without fail now, right? Teaching a computer to do that prior to 2015 was incredibly difficult. Because if you think about all the different variations by which a line can be expressed on a piece of paper, the shadows, the angles, the so forth, how do you describe that in mathematical terms? It is tremendously difficult, right? What is easy for a 5-year-old is so hard for a computer. The technology that eventually solved this problem for us was machine learning, where we learned, to simplify it, if you showed a computer a picture of 1 million lions in various configurations, using the theory of machine learning, which was actually developed in the 1980s, it would eventually get exceptionally good at that particular task. So it would learn by looking at tons of data in order to do this. And what made this possible was, frankly, social media, where it was suddenly realistic to get 1 million pictures of something so you could train the AI. Right? That's what made it possible. And so eventually they started looking at pictures that, fueled autonomous driving because you could see and detect everything. They moved this over to language. And of course, we are now talking about generative AI, where machines are generating creative artifacts for you, right? Like paintings, music, text in English once you ask it a question. All these things are happening at a geometric rate, and it is, just incredible what we're going to see in the next 5 years.
So the federal government just made an announcement for $2.4 billion into AI, taxpayers' dollars.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much you've sort of dug into that, but
a little bit. A lot more. If it was during the Darwin stage, I would have been all over this.
Right.
Now I just kind of read it and say, okay, that's interesting.
But just sort of generally speaking, I mean, you're a Canadian. You've seen, $2.4 billion of your taxpayers' dollars going to this thing called AI.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we'll start with the average citizen. Like, why is this a good investment for Canadians? And then maybe we can talk about, small businesses in Canada and the like.
So all countries, including Canada, need to reimagine their economies to include artificial intelligence. Not to be artificial intelligence, but to ask the question, how are we going to leverage this incredibly powerful technology and modernize our economies to compete globally? Right? So how are we going to use it in natural resources? How are we going to use it in HR? How are we going to use it with the elderly? How are we going to use it with education? Everybody is asking this question. A good friend of mine, this will be interesting. His second cousin is the head of state of a Caribbean island. I can't say which one.
Okay.
But they're already trying to reimagine, how do we move our economy from being a tourist economy to infuse AI into it in a way that reimagines our economy, right? Like a Caribbean island is thinking about this. So this is an imperative for any country, including Canada, to have policy is probably too small a word, to have a strategy, a global strategy of leveraging this technology. Now, so it's good from that standpoint. As someone who ran a company in Canada and tried to get access to funding like this, it's always in the details, right? I like the precedent it sets for AI in our country. I always worry about billion-dollar initiatives from government. Not to be cynical, because the intent and it's right. The execution is what's key, right? Who is spending this money? What are we doing with it? I think it's a good thing overall. I just think that, I hope it doesn't become political the way these things always sometimes do, and it gets into, it ultimately doesn't benefit our country. So I think it's a good thing. even if it results in peripheral initiatives that eventually actually are the transformative ones, that might be okay. But as a citizen who pays taxes like yourself, I probably would, want to ask questions about, okay, like this is a good thing, but how are we accountable to this money, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like all things, but I think overall it's a good initiative.
So whether it's this initiative or not, I mean, if you were sort of starting a small business now,
Yeah.
However many years younger, I mean, how would you look at AI in terms of a component of your business plan and wanting to build something,
Yeah.
build a successful business?
Yeah. The analogy I sometimes use is imagine the internet in 1994, 1995, right? The internet was just becoming a thing. And many businesses really didn't understand it, but it was a crucial component it could be a crucial component of your business. And now, of course, you can't imagine a business operating without the internet. Can you imagine that, Chris? Like,
right.
Even if you're my Italian barber who I've gone to for the last 30 years has an online booking system to make it easier, and he's on the internet. So if he's on the internet, everybody has to be on the internet. So the same thing applies to artificial intelligence, right? It is a powerful tool in various forms. If you're a flower shop, how can you use artificial intelligence to predict orders and plan Mother's Day and certain things like that? Like, it is an incredibly powerful tool where it doesn't need to be your strategy, because the building of AI is AI companies, but it needs to be a tool, an appendage to your business to enhance your business in some way. And I can guarantee you that if you're not thinking about it, your competitors are thinking about it, and so you need to innovate along those lines, right? And what I would say is, don't start with the tooling first. The mistake many entrepreneurs make is they look at what ChatGPT can do, they look what these technologies can do, and then they go to the market trying to figure out, like, how can I plug this into a place where it might work? I would say, look at the industry that you are interested in. Is it climate change? Is it the elderly? Is it education? And find out what the biggest needs are, the biggest pain points are in those industries, and then ask the question, how can AI potentially crack a problem here, right? That's the way I'd go about it.
I want to talk maybe a little bit about sort of two aspects of fear. One's really around change, and one's around AI specifically. So the first one, maybe change, we can tackle that. I mean, people don't like change.
Yeah.
I think just in general, for a whole bunch of reasons. How would you recommend somebody, sort of an average Canadian, or even the small business example you just gave, incorporating AI into their lives? Like, how do you go from not having something, especially something that maybe seems incredibly esoteric, to having that in your life, especially when, I mean, there's no way this is going back in the box. So this is the reality. It's moving forward, which can be even more frightening in a way, because you haven't got this a level of control.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, whether or not you know it, you're probably using AI every single day when you use your iPhone or phone or get into a car, because there's AI embedded in there that is looking at your patterns, figuring out what content to serve you. When you use YouTube, for example, so you're already using AI, right? But I would say to the average person is, if you're old enough, think about the first time you used a BlackBerry, or the first time you used the computer, and how scary that was. Right? And eventually it just became a part of your life because it kind of had to. The same thing is going to happen with artificial intelligence. So try ChatGPT. I know it could be kind of scary. Pull it up, just start asking questions. Have fun with it. Right? See what it can do. If you're a bit older, more likely than not, your children or your nephews or somebody that's 10 years younger than you is using this already. Right? So just start playing with it, is what I would encourage people to do. And the ideas that will flow from that, and the comfort that will eventually result, you'll be surprised at what will happen. right? You talked about the fear of artificial intelligence, and yes, there are legitimate questions around its scope, its power, autonomous decision-making for critical areas that we need to think about and that practitioners in those domains really need to pay attention to. And so, yes, I think a certain amount of this $2.4 billion was earmarked towards AI safety and ethical behavior and so forth, which is important. But for the average person, I would say just start using it. Even if it's in a fun way, like, image generators. Things they can do right now. Like, render me an image of my grandson at Canada's Wonderland with a bear, attacking him. And you'll just have so much fun with that, So use it the way you find the inner child in you when you start leveraging it. And I think that, that's what I would recommend to people.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sort of break down that fear is play and have fun and get your inner child to come out and explore a little bit. I agree with that. Maybe on the ethics part a little bit, because I find this interesting on so many fronts, and I've discussed, or at least I've looked at this issue for a number of years, just having been in the military, and of course autonomy is, when you pair autonomy with lethality, you have some serious questions that need to be answered. My sense is that and maybe this is just the reality, that technology is always going to outrun the discussion about ethics and the philosophy around how we employ some of these things. I don't know, but I do get that sense on a number of fronts that we tend to wait probably until it's too late before we start having these discussions around, like, how does the ethics of something. So it could be, autonomous systems. It could be a variety of things with technology. But is it possible, do you think, that we can actually get ahead of it and have these sort of mature discussions and constantly be philosophizing on exactly having these discussions about what this means to Canada? What does AI mean to Canada? How are we going to employ this? What are the guardrails on this? Are these things possible to be done ahead of time, or is the pace just so fast and the number of people who truly understand it so small that having that discussion within the democracy and the form of government we have is really challenging?
Unfortunately for me, it's very much the latter. So when I was at Darwin, I think maybe 2 or 3 years, I was on a number of, I don't know if committee is the right word, but Canada was coming up with, I think it was Bill 56, which was privacy and AI training and so forth. And so I was on calls with conservative MPs and liberal MPs trying to formulate policy. And I was, an AI expert in that context, commenting on the appropriateness of certain aspects of the legislation. And I think only now is the legislation crystallized, but the problem is it's now obsolete because of generative AI, right? So the challenge I often see with this is the technology just moves so much quicker than the ethical contemplation around it. And by the time the non-experts start to wrap their heads around it and ask these questions, the practitioners are on to the next. And, it's not out of... They're not nefarious. They're like people that in general, people that make AI are curious scientists. Mm-hmm. The way maybe the people that first talked about nuclear chain reactions were curious scientists. I honestly wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, Chris, because I'm still thinking about it. Is yes, there has to be regulation for big topics like lethality and autonomy and so forth. But there's also smaller ones that we need to start thinking about, particularly around AI and children. You're seeing this play out with the whole TikTok, controversy, let's say, in the United States and Canada. Like, children are constantly watching this stuff. And, we control what they watch on TV, because there's regulations around, children programming, and I grew up in the age of Sesame Street and so forth, and the content that they now consume, which is largely served up by AI, right? Mm-hmm. And you likely know this, but children in China, when they go to TikTok, see science experiments, see educational content, see things that are frankly beneficial for them. Children in North America don't see that. And this is a strategic thing that most people are convinced China is doing. So does government need to act in there? Absolutely. I don't know what the answer is, but, as somebody with a 5-year-old and a 10-month-old, yes, I absolutely think there needs to be some regulation around this.
We could make it analogous to our previous conversation about nutrition, that one country is having their kids shop at the grocery store with lean proteins, fruits and veggies, and lots of exercise, and we're at the rolling through the 7-Eleven picking up this, that, and the other for our kids.
Yeah. Absolutely. And look, especially conscientious parents, might be able to drag them to the grocery store every other day, right? To take your analogy further, but many parents are too busy to do that, and are not in an economic position to do that. Mm-hmm. So yes, there needs to be some real thinking around this.
Hey, before we get you back on your way to Toronto, Sheldon, is there anything you'd like to wrap up with for the listener?
I think the only last thing is, I often say that, so I have 2 children. I have Max, who's 5.5. I have Milo, who's 10. And Max represents the beginning of Darwin, because he was born about 4 or 5 months after we started Darwin. And Milo represents the end.
Sorry, I think you got that. Sorry, you said
Max represents the beginning of Darwin.
Right, so Max is 10.
Max is 5.
Okay, sorry.
Max is 5. Milo's 10 months. Sorry.
Oh, 10 months.
Milo's 10 months.
We can't have this. We can't have this in the public record. 10 months. Yep.
So Max was born about 4 or 5 months after we started Darwin, and Milo was born towards the end. And so for your listeners, there's a change of control at Darwin, such that I'm no longer involved with the company. But the interesting thing for me was raising a son in parallel with AI advancing, right? So here's my son, and this is my first child, so, Chris, you probably know what the first one is like. It's just a miracle, but it's crazy at the same time. And, and every day he was changing, and every day he was getting more advanced and so forth. And at the same time, I'm seeing all this progress with AI while I'm raising Max. And so the question for me is, and you're seeing this play out now in our society, is, somebody wrote an article of, will AI ever create a truly creative work, like a novel, right? And the person made the point of, look, there are words on paper that ChatGPT can write, sure, but the best art, the best literature, the best what have you, it moves you from a human point of view because the author knows what it is to have these human emotions, right? Like, if you think about great literature and the themes that are sometimes embedded in that literature, forgiveness, despair, depression. I mean, Dostoevsky was the master at this, Crime and Punishment. The question I think about is, will AI ever be able to create these artifacts if it doesn't know what it is to be human? Right, and experience some of these concepts in their totality. And then, of course, we get into the greater question of, well, will AI ever become conscious or self-aware in a way that, is recognizable? And I used to say, maybe 5 years ago, that I didn't think I'd see the answer to that question in my lifetime, but there's a good chance my son will see it in his lifetime. And given the progress that I've seen over the past 5 years, I think I may see it in my lifetime. I don't know what the answer will be, but it is going to be philosophically very interesting for me to see how this evolves.
It's been great spending time with you today, Sheldon, and this is a fantastic conversation. And this is what I love, is that we meandered all over the place. We did. And that's so much fun. Thank you for taking the time, for coming out to Waterloo and being one of our Northern Sentinels.
No problem, Chris. A pleasure, and a pleasure to meet you in person finally.
You can find information in the show notes on Waterloo's co-op program, Darwin AI, Canada's recent investment in artificial intelligence, and Sheldon's book recommendation, Daring Greatly, by Brene Brown. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.